Hello, welcome to the IERLab Podcast. Now, who is IERLab? IERLab is the Influencer Ethnography Research Lab located at Curtin University in Perth, Western Australia. Now, what do? We specialize in the methodologies and the pedagogies of influencer research. I'm your host, Walter Lee, and I'm here to bring you, our listeners, a more in-depth look on what's going on in the world of influencer culture. Our series will feature researchers, scholars, and students on influencer culture. Today, we will be focusing on the area of virtual influencers, meaning animated, fictional characters, AI influencers, and so on. These virtual influencers may not be the skin and bone that we are so used to. However, do they have the possibility to influence the world like humans do? We are going to look at that in a little bit of depth with today's guest. Now, today's guest is a PhD candidate in the Internet Studies at Curtin University. She completed her MA in Media, Film and Television Studies at the University of Auckland and has several years of experience in the advertising industry as a digital media specialist. She is here to give us a better idea on the future of virtual influencers. Welcome to the show, Rachel Berryman.
Hi, Walter. It's lovely to be here.
Lovely to have you today. I can't wait to talk about this interesting subject of virtual influencers, because as a person who's maybe on the little bit of the older side, I wouldn't say old, but I don't quite understand the influencer side when it comes to virtual influencers. I'm so looking forward to hearing what you have to say, but I guess my first question would be, how did you get interested in virtual influencers? Was there one that personally influenced you?
Yeah, so my first encounter with virtual influencers was completely unexpected. Back in 2018, I was in the middle of a YouTube marathon and I stumbled across a video on pop culture conspiracies that featured an American virtual influencer called Lil Miquela. So at the time, Lil Miquela was one of the most popular virtual influencers on the scene, largely because no one knew what or who she actually was. So she claimed to be a regular 17-year-old girl from Los Angeles, but there was something about the way she looked that didn't seem quite right. So like other teenagers, her Instagram feed was full of selfies with friends and trendy spots around LA, but she looked super photoshopped. Her skin was too smooth and her hair was exactly the same in every single one of her photos. And as the video explained to me, there was huge interest in uncovering Miquela's actual identity. Like, who was she if she was an actual human being? Or who was behind her account if it was being run by someone else? And why were they running her account? But for the first 2 years on Instagram, Miquela really staunchly defended her claims of being just a regular teenage girl and shrugged off all accusations that there was anything amiss. And by the time I found the YouTube video, the plot of Lil Miquela had really thickened. So the YouTube video was on in the background, and I found myself completely immersed in Miquela's Instagram feed. And there I found these new posts revealing that Miquela's Instagram account had been hacked and that she was actually a quote unquote robot that had been designed and saved from an evil corporation by some technological do-gooders at a company called Brut. So the dramatics were high. At the time, Miquela's most recent posts were these emotional self-reflections about coming to terms with her fabricated memories and the fact that she wasn't actually human. So it felt very sci-fi movie. Ex machina kind of thing. Other characters had also been added to the mix. So Miquela's best friend and also an arch nemesis, who both had the same sort of computerized appearance as Miquela did. And I think that night I spent an hour clicking and scrolling through Instagram. And when I looked up, the video that I had been watching was so long finished. But I do remember going to my best friend's house that night and regaling him and his flatmates at length about the whole saga and passing around a phone with Miquela's Instagram account, seeing the bewildered expressions on their faces. And of course, Miquela wasn't actually a robot, but it was clearer than ever that what her Instagram account was this kind of dramatic storyline that had Miquela as its star. So then fast forward to 2020, and I discovered a call for applications for a PhD project that was about virtual influencers and working with two amazing supervisors, Professor Tama Lever and Associate Professor Crystal Aberdeen. And it really felt like a sign, like a chance to finally explore the thread that had piqued my interest so intensely years before. But back then, I really didn't know just how deep the rabbit hole went. So over the course of my research, I've discovered hundreds of characters that identify as virtual influencers based all over the world. Michaela is just one of this huge global network of fictional characters that use social media to accumulate audiences that they can then parlay into commercial deals with brands and promote messages to, just like human influencers do. I also discovered that Michaela's story is unique rather than representative. In other markets, virtual influencers exist without quite so much mystery or fanfare, but they're still hugely popular, boasting like hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of followers, with significant backing from venture capital and often partnering with major brands.
That's quite interesting. Well, I'm actually looking at Michaela's Instagram as we speak, and she appears to have a partner. Is that partner also, I guess, an AI generated partner, or is that a
No,
supposed real
that is
person?
a human model.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
yeah, they've had a whole trajectory. They were together, then they broke up, and she wrote some breakup songs, a la Taylor Swift, and then eventually they kind of rekindled their romance, and now they're back on again.
It feels like the very first Instagram drama, whatever. Obviously, this is made and the storyline is made.
Totally.
I,
And there
I,
was one point that I would describe my research as like a soap opera because there was so many different storylines going on. Sometimes they intersected and they did collaborations with each other, and it felt like a crossover episode.
hmm.
But other times, there were these peaks and troughs. But yeah, that's a very particular type of virtual influencer, the ones that do that soap opera
Mm,
style. But
mm.
Michaela is definitely like the pinnacle of that.
Has her real identity come out?
No, no, after all
Ah,
this time. But yeah, it has been now. Her account was created in 2016,
yep.
so it's coming on 7 years. So I would say that the identity is has been changed in that time. We
Mm,
know who's behind it, the company.
mm,
It was valued at one point, the company Brud, at $125 million.
mhm.
So like huge interest in that company and what they could do. But I think, yeah, they've kind of kept up the character, but things have changed in the back end.
I was under like the impression that like virtual influencers was a fairly new concept. I read that there's actually a sort of difference between virtual influencers and virtual celebrities. Could you maybe tell us the difference between the two?
Yeah, totally. One of the components of my PhD project that I've really, really enjoyed was this deep archival research into the different trajectories of virtual celebrities that have given rise to virtual influencers as we know them today.
Hmm.
And in that, there are four main histories to acknowledge, which I'll just kind of briefly give
Mhm.
you an overview of. So the first is from Hollywood, where digital effects artists have been creating animated characters known in the industry as synthespians or synthetic thespians to
Mm,
populate crowds, complete stunts, and even take on starring roles in large Hollywood movies.
mm,
Synthespians was a big buzzword in the film industry in the 1990s. Producers loved the idea of not having to cater to the outrageous demands of human stars
mm,
and an actor essentially on call 24/7 who wouldn't need rest or any breaks. But actors were much more skeptical, not only because they were likely to be out of a job if the dream of the synthespian came true, but also because they doubted the ability of animation to convey the truth and the art of acting. And this kind of really reached its peak in 2001 with the film Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within,
mm,
which promised but largely failed to deliver a convincing synthespian performance. But we saw the technology that inspired that conversation originally continue to develop after that point, especially with the likes of Weta Workshop and characters like Gollum from The Lord of the Rings,
mm,
King Kong, and leveraging that Hollywood investment. That trajectory continued and contributed to the photorealistic appearance, the compositing techniques, and the technological translation of human actions into animated motions that are still used by virtual influencers today. So that's the first kind of history. The
mm,
second one is the virtual idols of East Asia. So virtual idols was originally a term that was used to describe any idol that appeared in anime or video games, but gradually came to describe fictional computer-generated characters who were designed to succeed as musicians in the idol industry. The second kind of virtual idol first appeared in Japan in 1996 with Kyoko Date and her much more prominent predecessor, Yuki Tsurai, around a year later. So the virtual idol phenomenon soon spread across East Asia. It spawned cyber idols like Adam in Korea and also beyond. So during the late 1990s, there were a bunch of virtual idols that released singles, which ranked in national music charts. They had websites with downloadable wallpapers, very exciting for the time, and forums where you could talk to other fans and also potentially receive a message from the idol themselves. They also starred in TV commercials for products like soda and toothpaste. So they were a really big deal. And they sold heaps of merchandise and idol goods like DVDs with animated films, action figures, photo books, a whole lot of stuff. And the ambition and the commercialization approach was really firmly in place, and it was all borrowed from the idol industry formula that was already several decades in the making by that point. But the cost of technology was really too great for the vision of those virtual idols to be sustained in the long term. Then, kind of around the same time, we had a different break off of that history in Europe and the US, which is where the success of virtual idols in East Asia, coupled with the massive popularity of the video game protagonist Lara Croft of the Tomb Raider franchise, inspired a cohort of what the press divisively call cyber babes. So cyber babes were hyper-feminized, computer-generated characters that appeared in the West in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And in general, they were designed either to break into entertainment industries, so like music, modeling, or acting, or they were used as interfaces for new technologies, so like online news bulletins or voice assistants. But again, the technology was an impediment. It cost too much and took way too long to produce performances for these cyber babes. And after the initial novelty of their creation lost its purchase in the press, they also faded out of the limelight. And the fourth history is more recent, and it is in large part a continuation of virtual idols. Vocaloids are probably what would come to mind for most people who hear the terms virtual celebrity or virtual pop star. Hatsune Miku, arguably the most popular Vocaloid, has performed as a hologram at sold-out concerts all around the world. Vocaloids also originated in Japan, but they involve quite a different dynamic to the other trajectories I've mentioned. Vocaloid is a label for the animated characters that are designed to represent the different voice banks of Yamaha's Vocaloid technology, which is a voice synthesizer that was released in 2004. The technology was originally created for professional musicians, but after the release of its second generation in 2007, which included Hatsune Miku, it gained unexpected popularity. Ordinary people could buy and use the software to create their own songs using the voice of their favorite character. And social media became a really important platform for sharing these original songs, as well as choreographed performances as well. And those sellout holographic concerts I mentioned, they include performances of the songs that were created by fans and shared online originally. And these kind of cartoonal Vocaloids have come to serve as brand ambassadors for a really wide range of products, services, and social messages across East Asia. So I know that that's like quite a long-winded history, but I think it's really important context for recognizing that there is so much about virtual influencers that isn't new. We've seen the promises of these computer-generated replacements for different kinds of celebrity emerge and re-emerge since at least the 1990s. But what distinguishes virtual influencers in this timeline are two main elements. So the first relates to the virtual quality of virtual influencers, and specifically the skills and technology that's required to create them. So whereas in the 1990s, you would have needed like a huge computer with massive processing power, a massive team, and many weeks to produce even 30 seconds of animated footage of a synthespian or a virtual idol, today that technology is so much more accessible. You can use your home computer to download software that allows allows you to design and render these really high quality animations in far less time. It's also a lot more affordable. There are so many industry grade tools that offer subsidized subscriptions for independent creators, as well as some amazing community powered open access tools that are capable of creating really impressive results. And finally, although there's still a wealth of formally trained talent, there's also this kind of democratization of technology, of this technology online, especially with portals like YouTube, which contain so many tutorials allowing people to train and upskill in new skills and software. So whereas virtual celebrities used to be really centralized and produced by specific teams, often with established ties to the to the entertainment industries, now there's potential for anyone with a computer, an internet connection, dedication, some good luck, and a lot of perseverance to try their hand at creating their own animated character and developing it into a virtual celebrity. The second point of departure relates to the influencer label of virtual influencers. So this is really important because it aligns these characters with a specific genre of internet celebrity. And as you might expect, a central component of this is the accessibility of these characters via social media. So social media platforms serve as the primary site of our contact with virtual influencers, which in itself is really interesting for what Jenny Davis and Nathan Jurgensen could describe as context collusion, or an intentional collapse of contexts, which in this case are reality and fiction. So whereas earlier types of virtual celebrity were experienced in spaces that were obviously demarcated, like the dedicated homepages for virtual idols, we are increasingly likely to encounter posts from virtual influencers between posts from our favorite celebrities, friends and family, or like other human influencers. The social media setting also means that virtual influencers need to use the affordances, norms, and vernaculars of social media to cultivate their brand and also to reach and build an audience that they can then use for commercial activities. So just like human influencers do. So to summarize, I would say it's the heightened accessibility of virtual influencers, both in terms of the technology that can be used to create them and also the spaces where we encounter them, that distinguishes virtual influencers from the types of virtual celebrities that came before them.
Yeah, you're right. It's important to know the history. As a person who grew up in the 90s, I never saw these, I guess, virtual celebrities as influencers at all. Or, I was a part of the gaming world, so I did play Tomb Raider. I didn't think of her as sort of like anything but a playable video game character. And then when I think back, I'm like, yeah, she was actually used a lot in advertisements, and her face was so recognizable that everyone knew who she was. It was quite fascinating to think about that when I was I guess I was in my teens at the time when she was extremely popular. And I never realized that, oh, wow, she was sort of an influencer back in the day. But talking about, you just mentioned as well, the different, like the human element of influencing. I just kind of want to know, in some cases, in a lot of cases, should I say, human influencers or just real people, they they get some general hate from the public. Usually if they've done something wrong, or they've said something wrong. It could be any situation. Now, have there been any, like, maybe a reported case or anything that springs to mind of a virtual influencer crossing that line or coming under heavy controversy?
Totally. Like, one of the misconceptions around virtual influencers, and this is a misconception that they themselves often perpetuate, is that virtual influencers are scandal free. There have been quite a few instances where virtual influencers have crossed the line and have kind of had been held accountable for their actions. So often this comes down to virtual influencers trying to be too relatable. They've posted about mental health struggles or other traumatic experiences. And with human influencers, this kind of intimate confession can be a way of building bonds with the audience and making followers feel like a trusted confidant. But when it's a virtual influencer, this kind of disclosure can be seen as really insensitive and also exploitative,
Hmm.
using fabricated stories of pain or trauma to gain clout essentially
Yeah.
online. And in other instances, it relates to questions of identity and who is creating or telling the stories of virtual influences, particularly when it comes to marginalized cultures or communities. So this is really pronounced when the creator's own lived experience doesn't match with the cultural identity that they've ascribed to their character. And it's further compounded when the creator's lived experience is one of significant privilege. So this is very much in line with kind of a couple of decades of critical commentary around how identity is articulated online, and what critical media scholar Lisa Nakamura calls identity tourism, but what more recently has been labeled in specific contexts as the likes of blackfishing or queer baiting. These terms all kind of raise questions about appropriating marginalized identity for their aesthetic and commercial value without really grappling or understanding or recognizing the complexities and the lived realities of socially, politically, and economically marginalized groups.
What I find interesting, I'll go back to the Michaela situation because I'm still looking at her Instagram. Now, her ethnicity is not, well, it's not specified, and therefore she's AI. I don't know what she identifies as, but she has the hashtag Black Lives Matter on that. Um, is that like sort of controversial in your opinion? Because we are unaware of her. Has she ever specified like if she's like African American or if she's a mixture of anything? And possibly the fact that also, as you said, the models of Michaela could change, like the person could change, but the image still stays the same. Is there sort of an importance on like, well, you don't have to be African American or of black color to support Black Lives Matter, but she does hint at some sort of a darker tone in her skin complexion. Do you think this is important, or do you think this is controversial?
So Michaela has identified as half Brazilian,
Okay.
and half American. And the Black Lives Matter is actually a kind of a core component that supporting that cause is a core component of her identity. So one of her creators, Trevor McFredries, has kind of pinpointed the origins of Michaela as to recognizing the socio-cultural impact of the TV show Will and Grace,
Okay.
which he kind of discovered had done a lot for acceptance of LGBTQI
Mm.
plus individuals kind of in America, just from the exposure that that show gave. So he kind of came up with this idea, like, what if we had a character who was also kind of opening people's eyes to the struggles of these communities, and Black Lives Matter is a really important one for Michaela. That's been kind of it's been followed through as much of her journey as kind of it has overlapped with in terms of the social cause. I think for me, it's always important that if you have influence to do good with it, that's
Hmm.
like my personal stance. And so I do think that it's important for, people with platforms to be supporting political causes. But I do think it does raise questions about potentially appropriating those sorts of hashtags, and also those sorts of conversations and dominating those conversations, especially when you might like the character might not identify with the groups that are leading those conversations. So it's a
Mm.
really complicated situation.
It does seem like a
But
very fine line, doesn't it?
yeah.
Like I've also, like you mentioned as well, like people hopping on clout, and I've talked to,
Hmm.
To Professor Crystal, and we talked about, people who are using hashtags in order just to get the attention from social media, even though it's something that they might not really be interested in, but since it's trending, they're using those hashtags like "Pray for Paris" or this
Yeah.
kind of thing. And not saying that Michaela is this kind of person, but it is somewhat an interesting thing that she has, I don't know, posted, because it's the very first line of her, or apart from her name, it's the very
Mm.
first line of her profile. So I thought that, like, if this is quite interesting that this is the hashtag that she's chosen. But
Yeah.
moving on to our next question, which is also sort of related as well. Listen, like I said, I didn't quite understand the meaning of social, like virtual social media influences. However, I'm always open to learning, of course, and I want to know the like positives and also the negatives of virtual influences. And are there any potential dangers?
Yeah, I mean, I completely understand the skepticism
Mhm.
throughout this project. I've kind of gone from one polar extreme to another, and I've kind of settled somewhere in the middle. But there are two things that I'm most cautious about, and they both revolve around transparency. So,
Mm,
as I mentioned, in Michaela's early years, before she revealed the identity of her creators, it was like very much kept a secret who her creators were, what she was, what her motivations were. And
mm,
lots of other virtual influencers also deliberately obscure the identity of their creators, basically to keep up the kind of the fiction, you know.
mm,
And some even obscure the fact that they are virtual. And because of the super convincing animation and photo editing tools that they're using, they're practically indistinguishable from a human influencer on the first or second or third glance.
mm,
So for me, that raises two kind of questions. So the
mm,
first is a question around beauty standards, and an
mm,
impossible standards of beauty. And this comes to mind especially when I see virtual influencers promoting skincare or
mm,
cosmetics, because those sorts of endorsements implicitly convey the idea that using those products can get you closer to that artificial ideal.
yeah.
When it's unclear that the model is not a real human being, that becomes even more pressing of a concern. The second part of that is a question of accountability for the actions and also the endorsements of virtual influencers. So when the creators keep their identity a secret, it can be really difficult to recognize the motives of the characters and whose interests the characters are acting in.
Mm.
And that for me is quite a problematic kind of area. So for these reasons, there have been a few different sectors of the virtual influencer industry that have called for clearer identification of the virtuality of virtual influencers, whether that's through image watermarks or labels in the profiles or in post captions. And actually, in August 2021, India's advertising standards body were the first to publish guidelines that required virtual influencers to disclose that the users were not interacting with an actual person, in
Mm.
addition to any disclosing any paid messaging. And since then, there have been other advertising bodies that have followed suit. So I think we're slowly kind of getting towards a space where understanding that there is a whole spectrum of things that you're going to encounter online, but especially with the likes of verification ticks on social media, that becomes a lot blurrier in terms of what these kind of these symbols represent in terms of how you can trust the thing that you're seeing.
I think you brought up a very good point there when it came to beauty standards. I mean, this is something that like we don't even need AI influencers to change the perception of beauty standards because we have filters out there, right? A lot of
Hmm.
people use filters. I've got plenty of friends who do it, and I tell them, you shouldn't do that because it's not who you are. I mean, you're fine the way you are, but when you're actually creating a person that looks, I guess, perfect in a way because you're not going to have any imperfections on like an AI um uh, influencer, for example. Like there wouldn't be a wrinkle or there wouldn't be like an out of place spot that the creators have made. And yes, a lot of young girls, especially the younger generation, are looking at these influencers, whether they believe they're AI or not, or just women in general, and they're hoping to achieve something that is, well, I guess, virtually impossible. So, virtually,
That is a constant battle for me trying to avoid that phrasing.
but like even like with the likes of Michaela, we'll go back to her. I mean, she is flawless. I mean,
Mm,
her face is, her proportions are quite unique in a way. I mean, I don't like her eyebrows. I think maybe she needs to get, but no, it's fine. But like, yes, it is important, and the dangers of actually teaching, women that this
yeah.
is the new age of women. It can kind of be disheartening, and as a father to a daughter you know, who knows what this technology is going to be like in 15 years, right? It's going to
Mm,
be crazy. And I don't want my daughter to look at something like this and go, hey, I want to be as beautiful as this person.
Yep.
when it's unachievable, to be honest with
Yeah.
you. Um,
And there's also the inverse of that as well. So uh, it's something that I call inscribed fallibility,
mm,
which is basically when flaws are deliberately placed onto these,
mm,
animated beings in order to make them feel more fallible, more human,
mm,
more kind of vulnerable, and often that comes down to the way that they look. And
mm,
so there is a virtual influencer in China whose name is Angie,
mhm,
and when she was first introduced, she actually got a bunch of online hate because commenters were pointing out the fact that her teeth were slightly crooked, that her teeth were slightly yellow, that her ears were a bit of a weird shape. And so these kind of attempts on the behalf of the creator to make her more like a ordinary teenage girl actually
mm,
inspired this backlash, where people were hypercritical of the fact that these like blemishes had been added to her
mm.
appearance. So it's such an interesting line to balance, seeing how some characters are, raised up and put on this pedestal, and others are purposefully kind of trying to avoid that, but then the different reactions that they receive on both ends. You
Oh,
can't you
that's
can't
really
kind of win. It's
fascinating.
a double bind.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like a win-win situation because I
No.
think it'd be just criticized on both sides. But
Hmm.
talking about the future of like virtual influences, this is what I'm really interested in seeing how far we can go. I mean, if
Mm.
you are a normal human influencer, there is like a lot of requests for like meet and greets, and we've seen holographic concerts before. I mean, Tupac did it, and then there's a
Hmm.
few others. But at the moment, I think it would just be very difficult for social media influencers to replicate this sort of thing, because a lot of money would go into the project itself. And like virtual influencers, though they might make a lot of money, or the company makes a lot of money, to do that, I imagine, would just be a very, very big task for the
Mm.
company. But with technology always evolving, from what you've researched so far, where do you see the evolution of virtual influencers heading?
It's a great question. So I think in focusing on the idea of the meet and greets, the early years of the pandemic were actually a really interesting case study for that, because without opportunities for physical touch and physical proximity,
Hmm.
many celebrity meet and greets had to be completely reconfigured.
Hmm.
So in Japan, for example, the hugely popular Japanese idol group AKB48, they have the slogan "Idols You Can Meet," and they regularly hold what are known as handshake events, where fans
Hmm.
can line up to give their favorite members of the group a handshake. But during COVID, those popular handshake events, they were pivoted to these virtual meet and greets, like autograph live streams and private video calls. So we kind of saw them changing the physical touch into kind of this virtual intimacy. And sometimes they even took place in wholly virtual worlds. So in September 2020, the K-pop idol group Blackpink held a virtual fan signing event in the mobile app Zapito that
Hmm.
attracted over 46 million visitors.
Hmm.
So it was like hugely successful. And even just a couple of weeks ago, I saw a TikTok of the pop star Olivia Rodrigo conducting a virtual fan meet and greet from a large television screen, responding to a live video feed of her fans who had physically waited in line to say hi to her and ask her questions. So those sorts of events are like very obviously well suited to virtual influencers seeking to kind of create those intimate bonds with their followers, because
Hmm.
they can be entirely orchestrated online without any kind of physical interactions.
Hmm.
But in addition to those sorts of online events, I think that virtual influencers who are interested in traveling from the virtual to the actual world will be taking a lot of cues from VTubers or virtual YouTubers who are using real-time motion capture technologies to conduct these multi-hour live streams on sites like YouTube and Bilibili and Twitch. And I view virtual influencers and VTubers kind of like cousins.
Hmm.
They share this genealogy, and so there are some similarities between them. But VTubers are more focused on the live streaming. They're running broadcasts that are akin to variety shows with these live interactions with their viewers. But I do expect that the technology that is so crucial to VTubing, which can really quickly translate physical cues into animated movements and expressions, that will be a really big part of virtual influencers' live interactions with their followers, whether or not that involves a physical screen. And I guess the final thing to say is that another future direction for virtual influencers has already begun. So lots of virtual influencers are currently experimenting with generative AI art tools and using these to create the visuals for their social media posts. And this could have really big implications for the sustainability of the virtual influencer industry. One advantage of virtual influencers, according to their creators, is that they sometimes involve a whole team of creatives, designers, and producers, and kind of obscure the jobs of potentially dozens of paid workers behind a single character. So for Michaela, for instance, when the company Brud was acquired by Dapper Labs in late 2021, I believe. Time means nothing to me anymore.
Okay.
In 2021, when they were acquired, basically the press releases announced that the company actually had 32 employees. So you can think about Michaela being the single kind of point on the pyramid, but there are 32 employees that are doing all the work behind all of her activities. But the rise of this like generative AI and the accessibility of it as well raises big questions for the role of workers, and whether their labor will still be required if generative AI becomes the norm for like the ideation and the execution of virtual influencers' social media content, but also whether this artificially generated content will hold the same appeal, or whether we'll see virtual influencers start to fade out, just as we did kind of quite a few of those other previous histories that I mentioned.
I mean, to be honest with you, we have to stop here, but I really think I could talk about this all day. Like, I've just got so many questions, like follow-up questions and questions that I'm just so curious about certain areas of the virtual influencer world that hopefully we can get you back on the show and, talk about a little bit more in depth. And like, just as we were talking, I was coming up with all these other questions. Like, I would love to ask you this question, but unfortunately we ran out of time. But before we go, is there anything that you'd like to promote, like maybe your future studies, your current work? Is there anything that you'd like to let our listeners know that you're up to these days?
I'm just so thankful for having the opportunity to be here today. So thank you so much, Walter. And I'm always keen to talk about virtual influencers if it's not already apparent. I could also talk about them for many hours. So if you would like to get in touch, you can find all of my contact details, updates about my research, and links to all of my previous publications at rachelberryman.com.
Okay, thank you so much for listening to today's episode, everyone, on the IERLab podcast. Once again, thank you to my guest, Rachel.
Thank you.
And until next time, this has been Walter Lee. You may click on your next adventure now.